Back to another video. Purple Political Talk here. Today is Monday, May 20th, 2024, and today we're going to be taking a look at Donald Trump's options for vice president and looking at these candidates and discussing who do I think right now would be the best pick for Donald Trump and who do I think actually Donald Trump might actually end up picking for his vice presidential nomination. And looking at it through the context of the general election and what impacts that will have on the race. But before we do get started, I want to remind you guys to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest content about the 2024 election. So without a further ado, let's get started with the video. Okay, so when we look at the candidates for vice president, the betting markets usually give you a pretty good view of who, generally speaking, are the main candidates right now, probably in consideration. I would say, with almost 99% certainty, Donald Trump's vice presidential pick will come from this list. And the reason is that what Donald Trump needs electorally, and ways that he could balance the ticket, I think is what pretty much almost everyone on this list could offer. There is some other people that, could have been on this list previously, but, little by little, as you guess, the vice presidential tryouts, because at the end of the day, this whole process of picking a vice president, it requires a lot of vetting and a lot of, making sure that the person that you're picking is the right candidate. And Donald Trump has been doing that, taking people to court, different rallies, different responsibilities that different people across the Republican Party have started to gain, as they've put in that spotlight and seen if, potentially there would be good candidates. But, as you go down on the list, you're going to find people who are very unlikely to become vice presidential candidates on behalf of Donald Trump. And I think, honestly, you're looking at probably someone within these top 8 choices per se. So what does Donald Trump need in a vice president? In my opinion, he needs someone that's going to balance him out. And I think balance him out primarily when it comes to rhetoric and things of that sort. A couple of the really big objections that a lot of people have to Donald Trump, especially a lot of independents in key states, has to do with, his demeanor and the way that he sometimes deals with things. And, I think that Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee should be almost a complete opposite to that. And I think the reality is that the vice presidential nominee usually does not play a huge role electorally, but in a close election, it might make a difference, especially when your candidates are pretty old, in comparison to, past American history. You have the oldest candidates in American history running for president. So you really have to look at this as a lot of people might look at this and say, we're also in a way voting for the vice president just in case something does end up happening, more so than maybe past elections. So with that being said, there's some people that I would even be that are high in the betting odds currently and high on Donald Trump's list and constituent events that I would eliminate off the list, and primarily Vivek Ramaswamy. I think Vivek Ramaswamy could potentially be a strong voice for the Trump administration. I think he might be the future a lot of the Trump Make America Great Again movement. But at the same time, he is too much like Donald Trump, and that's going to cost Trump, or could cost Trump in some very close states, right? And when you really look at what Donald Trump needs, we go back to the electoral map. I think, of course, these are not the ratings because, some of these states will end up going by lesser margins, for example, Virginia, Florida, Ohio, they won't go by a safe margin. But for the purpose of illustration, this is sort of, in my eyes, where the electoral map stands. These 7 states are going to be the deciding factors when it comes to this presidential election. So what does Donald Trump really need to do to win? And, he needs to basically run the South and the Sun Belt. If he runs North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, that puts him close. He needs to win one of the Rust Belt states as well. So, or if he loses a state like Arizona, then he would have to either win a Pennsylvania or a Michigan or win Nevada, for example. So Donald Trump's pathways to the presidency are pretty limited. He needs to pick someone that is going to help him make sure he wins in the Rust Belt. And some of the Rust Belt states are getting closer. And I do expect the Rust Belt being the closest part of this election. But the reality is that Donald Trump needs someone that can help him win in the Rust Belt. So looking at the 538 polling averages, which they do some analysis to, and they kind of fix it to make sure that they have a more accurate polling average, you see Donald Trump ahead by only around a point in most of the Midwestern Rust Belt states. He has the biggest lead currently in Pennsylvania. Now, these are very small leads within the margin of error. And I think it's very important that Donald Trump is able to pick someone that's going to help them win in the Rust Belt specifically and have that appeal to those working class voters. Because I think in part, Donald Trump has a lot of appeal in a lot of these areas, but having someone from that has that appeal is definitely going to help him out on the ticket. So when you start analyzing, I think that the current favorite is Tim Scott. And I think Tim Scott's role as a favorite comes less for the political reasons that I gave of him trying to win the Rust Belt, but more of an identity politics type situation. But the other thing is that Tim Scott has, he's very calm. He's the antithesis of Donald Trump. I think that it's very important to note that Tim Scott has also a big appeal potentially to some African American voters, and other types of voters like in the South. And I think he's going to do very well with helping out a bit with the suburban vote. I think Tim Scott doesn't really, I wouldn't say he's the best pick, but he's definitely not a bad pick. Someone like a Doug Burgum is very interesting when you're talking about the vice presidential race, because he is, a governor from a Midwestern state, but I mean, more from the Mountain Plains region, I would say. But, I don't know how good of an impact he's going to have on Trump's ticket. I think he would be sort of a Mike Pence type pick, not ideologically, but more so in the way that he brings a balance to the ticket. He is, again, someone that is very, very calm. I think he's relatable. I mean, he could be relatable when he goes out in campaigns. And he's been increasingly growing in popularity as to whether or not he thinks that people think that he could become the nominee. Donald Trump has consistently bring him out to events and having him there and trying out. Someone like a JD Vance is interesting. And if we went back to my political reason of who do I think Donald Trump would or should pick, I think JD Vance could potentially really bring a lot of the appeal to a lot of those Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania voters. But at the end of the day, I think that another area that Donald Trump is really going to look at to balance is that he wants to make sure that he I don't know necessarily if he's something he wants to definitely do, but I think with a lot of pressure from the party potentially might be pushed to make an identity politics pick. And it's not to say that a lot of these politicians are really surging because of their identities, because honestly, these are very accomplished politicians, and I think pretty much anyone on this list would be a strong vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump. But at the same time, someone like a JD Vance helps out electorally in somewhere like the Rust Belt, but I don't know what type of impact that would have down on the Sun Belts. Some other options. Marco Rubio. I think Marco Rubio would be interesting, but for this to happen, one of them would have to move out of the state of Florida or change the registration. So, I think that would be a little difficult. And I don't know if Marco Rubio is really the best person for the appeal to the Rust Belt. Now, what he will do, though, is a lot of help with Hispanic voters. Now, Hispanic voters are going to be an important group for Donald Trump in this election. Why? Take a look at states like Nevada and Arizona. I would even put Georgia in this column. These are states with a good chunk of Hispanic voters. And I want you to take a look at Florida, for example. What happened in Florida with Ron DeSantis, how Florida was turned into a maybe plus 1 or 2 Republican state to almost plus 10 a Republican state. a lot of it had to do with the Hispanic vote. It was very specific with the Cuban population down in Miami-Dade County, but a lot of those trends have also been like increasing. You could see in the polls, Donald Trump is increasingly doing better with Hispanic voters. If Marco Rubio is on the ticket and he is able to help with Hispanic voters, that could be a death blow for the Biden campaign, in the sense that in states like Arizona and Nevada, you're going to end up losing that support. Now, when you look at the Rust Belt, which again, it's important that Trump wins the Sun Belt, but even more important is that he ends up winning one of the states in the Rust Belt, or he will not be able to electorally win the election. The math does not add up. So I don't know if Marco Rubio is necessarily the strongest pick for somewhere like there. Someone like Elise Stefanik would be interesting. Elise Stefanik offers a perspective of youth. I think she is probably, the youngest candidate on this list. I think that she would offer, part of the being a woman helps with appeal to women voters. And I think, honestly, when you talk about who do I think out of these people would have maybe the best chance of going into a lot of suburban areas and gaining support there, I think someone like Elise Stefanik might be able to do that. And I think after this point on the list, I think you start getting towards the people that I'm not completely sold if Donald Trump would actually pick them. Like Vivek Ramaswamy, I think is a long stretch. Tulsi Gabbard would be a very interesting pick. I mean, that would be a very bold pick, because you're really talking about, someone who was a Democrat, only 4 years ago, ran for president as a Democrat in 2020. And I think it would be interesting, but at the same time, I don't know if strategically that might be the best pick, right? So with all of this being said, who do I think would have been the best pick for vice president? And I think there is no question. Nikki Haley would have been the best choice for Donald Trump, because Nikki Haley would have balanced out Donald Trump when it came to a lot of his ideology, but then also she would have been able to really appeal to some groups of voters, and really bring back potentially some of the voters that Trump has isolated, or rather voters that have isolated themselves from Trump in the last couple of years. So Nikki Haley would have been a great pick. I think she would have balanced Trump out really well, but she's out of the consideration because of everything that happened in the primaries, right? So with the options that we have, who is the best pick? And I would say this is a choice that is going to be very interesting to see Donald Trump make, because he has a couple potential routes that he could go. I would argue that the smartest pick out of these top 5 candidates that we have left, who knows, maybe it's someone that's not on this list, but, I would go, if I was Donald Trump, with maybe Doug Burgum. And I know this sounds like a pretty boring pick, but maybe that is what Donald Trump needs at this point. And, someone like a Tim Scott potentially be interesting, but you see, the thing that I don't really see about Tim Scott, I don't think the charisma is really there. And I think, when you're running with Trump, do you really need that much charisma? Maybe not. But, Tim Scott, also, one of the biggest issues that he's going to have is when it comes to abortion. That's another thing that Donald Trump is probably going to is probably thinking about deep down, because, look, the Democrats are running almost on this platform that is almost strictly on abortion, because that is the issue that won them election in 2022. And they know that is something that they can, offer a severe contrast. So that's where somewhere like a Tim Scott, I think, presents a lot of challenges. But again, there's a lot that can happen from here to when a presidential pick is finally picked closer to the convention. And ultimately, it's something that Donald Trump really have to look carefully at. I think he needs to pick someone that brings the least amount of attention possible to the ticket, and in regards to the scandals and things like that, of that sort, because frankly, he does not need that. Someone who I would have thought would have made a pretty strong vice presidential pick as well would have been someone like Glenn Youngkin. Again, Donald Trump and Glenn Youngkin have had, different you know, rough points within their relationships per se. And honestly, I don't think it's really in their best interest to take out a Republican governor in a state like Virginia, where that special election could easily go to the Democrats. So, but you see, like, Donald Trump needs to find a way to bring in those moderate voters who might have flipped from Biden to Biden in 2020, who voted for him in 2016. Voters like in Arizona, voters like in Georgia, and even in the Rust Belt states, because ultimately that's going to be the people who end up winning Trump the election. We have to remember, Biden only won the election by, a couple thousand votes in each of the states, right? That he ended up, carrying him over the 270 mark. So when you look at it in complete perspective, you have to really think about this. Trump needs to be able to win back those voters, and then that's going to be his pathway to victory, in addition to, of course, expanding the coalition. But, I think that there's a lot to be said about VP candidates. Things change on the daily, the current political environment with a lot of the cases, and with Donald Trump, who ends up supporting Donald Trump when it comes to that. For example, the people going to the courtroom or the rallies, all of these are tryouts, media interviews. And at the end of the day, a vice presidential pick needs to make sense, and a vice presidential pick needs to fit with the ticket. And honestly, I think eventually Donald Trump is going to find someone, and whoever that person is has, a really important role. And honestly, like, for that person as well, being Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate, it could be beneficial in some ways for your political career. Like, you're the chosen one. You're probably the next person to become the Republican nominee for president if Trump wins the election, or if Trump wins the election. But at the same time, if Trump loses the election, you're going to be in a really difficult situation. But that covers a little bit more of my thoughts on the current vice presidential nominee candidates. There's a lot to be said about all of them, but I want to hear what you think down in the comments. I think we have a very interesting group of people being considered. Do you think someone that's not on the list could be considered? I think there's a lot to be discussed. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to give it a huge thumbs up. Remember to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell to be up to date with our latest content regarding the 2024 election. Thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye.